Quite a number of us have had near-death experiences. But very few people can claim that their near-death experience actually happened in almost crashed aircraft where the passengers were seconds and centimeters from a fiery death in one of the most bizarre aviation accidents that's ever happened. The passengers of the Emirates flight EK407 were unaware of how close to death they had been in this accident, later described as the closest Australia had come to a major aviation catastrophe. Sounds crazy, right? Keep watching to find out what went wrong and how the disaster was narrowly averted just seconds before the plane almost crashed. The flight. Flight 407 was an international passenger flight that was scheduled to take off from Melbourne Airport, Australia on the 20th of March 2009. It was scheduled for a 14-hour trip from Melbourne to Dubai, UAE. It contained a total of 275 people, of which 257 were passengers and 18 were crew. It prepared to take off at 10:30 p.m. as was planned. However, things did not go as smoothly as had been planned. You see, a simple yet fatal mistake had been made. A failure that nearly led to the loss of all 275 lives on board. The failure. Flight 407 is a classic example of how terrible the effects of a simple mistake can be. An error as simple as one typo was responsible for the events that happened that night. Before the plane took off from the airport, the speed required for takeoff has to be calculated using the electronic flight bag. Parameters like the plane's weight need to be entered for the EFB to accurately calculate the needed speed for takeoff. In this case, the plane weighed 362.9 tons. However, when the first officer entered this into the EFB, he made a typo and entered 262.9 tons, thereby shaving off 100 tons of the actual weight of the plane. As you can guess, this led to a skewed result from the EFB. Maybe the error was as a result of the busyness that comes with preparing for takeoff. Maybe the first officer was merely negligent. Or maybe it was a simple human error. But that simple human error almost led to what would have been the most disastrous crash in Australian history. Usually, the pilot should check that the parameters entered by the first officer are correct. But for some reason, this check was never made. As a result, the chance to correct the mistake was lost, and it went unchecked. The near accident. Because the wrong parameters were entered, the results generated by the EFB were wrong, and the speed that is recommended was too slow to enable the plane to take off without a hitch. Rather than pick up speed, defy gravity, and glide into the air smoothly, the plane continued to sluggishly roll down the runway. The pilot ordered the first officer to initiate a nose-up command, 1 kilometer before the end of the runway, a command which should ordinarily give the plane the lift it needs to get off the ground. Unfortunately, this wasn't an ordinary situation, and rather than the plane easing into the air, it simply pitched upward, and the tail end struck and continued to drag along the runway. Then the pilot took over and applied maximum thrust on all 4 engines, using the takeoff go-around detent. The plane continued to cruise down the runway until it came to the end of the runway where it hit a strobe light. At 150 meters after the runway, it began to rise slowly and with a lot of difficulties. At 350 meters, it hit a localizer antenna array. At 500 feet, it narrowly avoided hitting the airport fence and glided over it. The pilot correctly deduced that the plane couldn't make the scheduled flight to Dubai, and he decided to calculate the landing parameters with the EFB. This was when he noticed that the flight parameters were off by 100 tons, and realized that this was the cause of the problem all along. Reports of smoke in the rear cabin came in, and he decided to return to Melbourne Airport for an emergency landing. But first, he had to dump fuel over Port Phillip Bay to make the plane lighter to ensure a safe landing, and he did this without any difficulty. The plane landed at 11:36 p.m., roughly an hour after it was scheduled for takeoff. Through all of this, the pilot made the wise decision to keep the passengers in the dark about the enormity of the situation. While they knew that something was wrong, they didn't know how bad it was, and most of them just assumed it was a minor mishap. In fact, when the plane returned to Melbourne Airport for an emergency landing, some of the passengers were seen laughing and chatting amongst themselves, unaware of just how close they had come to a fatal plane crash, and possibly the loss of their lives. Had the pilot not kept them in the dark, there would have been panic in the cabin, which would have definitely made things worse than they turned out to be. Luckily, the pilots were experienced, and they managed to land safely, thus averting a major disaster. The investigation. Despite his skill in handling the situation, the pilot, along with the first officer, was asked to resign from Emirates. An investigation into the accident was carried out by the Australian Transport Safety Bureau. As expected, the main focus of the investigation was how the first officer had managed to make such a grave mistake, how the pilot hadn't caught it on time, and why the rest of the crew hadn't realized that the plane's acceleration was too slow for the plane to take off until it was almost too late. 2 years after the events of March 20, 2009, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau released a report of the results of the investigation. The report showed that the accident was in no form due to a mechanical error. Instead, it was found that human error was 100% to blame for the barely averted disaster that Flight 407 could have been. In addition to the first officer's costly mistake, it was discovered that both the pilot and the first officer had flown more hours that month than the average. The pilot had a total flight time of approximately 99 hours in the past 30 days, which is about 20 hours more than the average. The flight officer had done approximately 88 hours in the air. Investigators tentatively concluded that fatigue may have contributed both to the flight officer's typographical mistake and the pilot's failure to spot the mistake. As a result of this incident, Emirates conducted a review of its flight procedures and introduced the use of the 2 EFB computers to ensure that parameters for takeoff and landing are entered twice, thereby cutting down on the likelihood of human errors leading to fatal accidents like the fate that almost befell Flight 407. Most times, our mistakes are inconsequential errors that can easily be rectified without much hassle. Indeed, it is highly unlikely that we'll ever make a mistake that will put the lives of 275 people at risk. If the pilots haven't been skilled or haven't caught the mistake on time, it would have resulted in a deadly plane crash that could have cost the lives of a lot of the passengers and crew on board, as well as any person on the ground who was unlucky enough to have been at the site in the crash. Who can imagine that a mistake as simple as only a minor digit change could turn out to be so fatal? Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. So guys, did you enjoy this video? If you found it interesting, then give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notifications so you can see more interesting videos like this one. Till next time.